Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Father Andrew Kellner. I serve as the rector here at the Church of St. Asaph's. And we started having conversations about having these forums way back in the spring, I think is when we first had our first meeting. So this has been a long kind of process of getting to where we are. And lots of things have changed in the world since then, especially in recent time. I just want to say that this is a big part of this is highlighting systems and structures that are in play within the Holy Land. That means that really justice and peace can't necessarily happen. Today is important in that kind of looking at that. I'll also say that today there is going to be use of some words that have multiple definitions. And some people define, for instance, Zionism one way, and some people define it another way. And I think that's an important thing for us to hold. That there's going to be times, Susan and I had a conversation this week, and there'll be times where I'll just say, Susan, let's kind of flesh this out a little bit, because there's lots of misunderstanding, and it makes it hard for us to actually have good dialogue and conversation. So as we start today, though, I do want to just start with a word of prayer as we think about our time and our conversation together. So, the table gets here. No, you're fine. Let us take a moment to remember that we are in the holy presence of God. Holy One, we thank you for the gift of conversation. We thank you that it helps us to learn and to grow and to move forward as community. We thank you for the grace, the courage, the strength to have this challenging conversation, to wade into multiple understandings and to conversations that are not always clear. We pray that you'd help us to have open hearts and open minds, and hearts that are moved for justice and for peace and by your love. We ask this in your holy name. Amen. Amen. Susan?
Is a tough topic. And this is a difficult time.
I should speak up a bit.
Sure, I may cough more, but I will speak up. Tell me if you can't hear me. I spend a lot of time in deep sadness, fear, heartbreak, compassion, grit, and with sparks of hope. I want to open with what in Hebrew is called a kavanah. It's an intention. A kavanah is the mindset of the heart. And for me, that is the words of Martin Luther King saying, we are tied to a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all of us indirectly. And for me, that means that what's happening in Israel and Palestine and Gaza and the West Bank and really all over the world affects us. And that what we're doing here, what we think, what we understand, and how we take that out into the world to act affects what's happening in Israel and Palestine and Gaza and the West Bank and all over the world. My heartfelt thanks to you, Pastor Andrew, the blessing of your coming to St. Asaph's. Some of us in this room were at a class that the group that I'm part of, Christian Jewish Allies for a Just Peace in Israel, Palestine, we held a class in this room in 2011, and Sue and Jim Proud were there, and George and Stevie Graves were there, and Mary, you probably were there. And Catherine, you were there. Anybody else that I don't remember? Yusreen. Thank you. Say your name again. Yusreen Malik. Yes, I remember you. Thank you. Okay. So the group that I belong to, Christian Jewish Allies for a Just Peace in Israel, Palestine, its name, our name reflects our mission, which when we were founded in 2009, we were spirited by a talk by Mark Braverman, in which he put out the notion that the movement for justice in Palestine could best be led by Christian churches, as what happened in civil rights and in apartheid South Africa. And that this could happen really only if that effort were supported by like-minded Jews who were able to have everybody's back against any perception of anti-Semitism. And so we started teaching these courses based on curricula from the Israel-Palestine Mission Network of the Presbyterian Church USA. We're all part of a larger project, and this Advent series is part of a project among our group, the Episcopal Peace Fellowship, Palestine-Israel Network, and Kairos USA. And the purpose of the project is to bring the experiences, voices, and lives of people in the Holy Land, mostly Palestinian Christians, particularly to local churches. Our interfaith, interdenominational work is grounded in the principle that all people have the right to equality, freedom, dignity, and self-determination. This was our original outline for today, and I took the liberty of adding October 7th and anti-Semitism. In our time together today, I invite you to be willing to step outside your comfort zone with an open heart and an open mind. May this be a safe space to experience difficult feelings and consider multiple competing truths. I encourage you to allow and to explore the cognitive dissonance which is inherent in this conversation. That's what you feel when you feel a kind of tension, because what I've said, what you've heard, what you've seen, either challenges or conflicts with what you believe you already know. If you're paying attention, that will happen, and we'll all bear that together. So let's take a deep breath and off we go. October 7th upended the status quo in Israel-Palestine in unfathomable ways. The heinous attack in Israel by Hamas and the taking of hostages are mind-blowing, despicable, and exponentially tragic. There is no moral universe in which acts of indiscriminate violence are acceptable. Every human being has the right to freedom, safety, decency, full stop. The history of Israel-Palestine has been shrouded in myths, misinformation, disinformation, omission, emotional entanglements, and political agendas. I'm of the opinion that what happened on October 7th didn't start on October 7th. I have more to say about all this and a lot of ground to cover. And there's a lot I'm leaving out. Please hang in. We'll do question and answers at the end. And if we don't get through it all, I will ask Andrew to invite me back so that we can, or you will, so that we can keep talking. Now, in this space and time, we have an opportunity and a moral imperative to consider the root causes of the current crisis. I use the phrase root causes, lots of people are using it, but I use it because I know, and you know, that problems that don't get addressed don't go away. In time, they explode. And when they do, our only recourse is to face them. And we know that times of upheaval can provide new possibilities. My prayer is that now is that kind of a time. Perhaps a global wake-up call to our collective conscience, to pay attention, to learn, to speak and act for justice in Israel and in Palestine. You beat me ahead on this.
Sorry.
Stay with it. Stay with it. As people committed to justice in Palestine, it really is important to ground all of our education and advocacy in an understanding of anti-Semitism, what it is and what it is not. There it is, simply. Anti-Semitism is discrimination in thought, speech, or action against people who are Jewish because they're Jewish. Next slide. And we want to clarify some critical distinctions. Judaism is a religion, a way of life based on justice for all people. Zionism is a political ideology that advocates a Jewish national homeland in historic Palestine. The State of Israel was established on May 14, 1948, as the national state of Jewish people. And criticism of the laws, policies, and practices of the State of Israel is not inherently anti-Semitic. Inherently is the operative word there. Advocating equality and human rights for Palestinians is not in itself anti-Semitic. Many progressive Jews these days are staunch social justice advocates who have opted out of support for Israel. Judaism doesn't require a commitment to Zionism. It's not a sin to be a non-Zionist. Actually, quite the opposite. On our Yom Kippur holiday, which is our Day of Atonement, I, for several years now, have participated in a reconstructed ritual in which we ask forgiveness for the crimes that are committed in our names in Israel and in Palestine. Next slide. So we're going to supplement those distinctions with some history and some quotes from people who were in the room where it happened, so to speak. Zionism emerged as part of a European nationalism and colonialism in the 19th century. a rise in violence and repression against European Jews in 1897 gave birth to the idea that Jews could only be safe in a home of their own. Caveats came from leaders within the Zionist movement, all of whom advocated for a cultural or a spiritual center in historic Palestine. They all promoted coexistence as a moral ethic of Judaism. I'll let a few of their voices speak for themselves. Founder of cultural Zionism, Ahad Ha'am in 1921 warned,
one thing we certainly should have learned from our past and present history, and that is not to create anger among the local population against us. We have to treat the local population with love and respect, justly and rightly. And what do our brethren in the land of Israel do? Exactly the opposite. Slaves they were in their country of exile, and suddenly they find themselves in a boundless and anarchic freedom, as is always the case with a slave that has become king. And they behave toward the Arabs with hostility and cruelty, infringe upon their boundaries, hit them shamefully without reason, and even brag about it.
thank you. Renowned philosopher Martin Buber, author of I and Thou, also in 1921, wrote,
Our national desire to renew the life of the people of Israel in their ancient homeland, however, is not aimed against any other people, as they enter the sphere of world history once more and become once more the standard bearer of their own fate. The Jewish people, who have constituted a persecuted minority in all countries of the world for 2,000 years, reject with abhorrence the methods of nationalistic domination under which they themselves have suffered. We do not aspire to return to the land of Israel, with which we have inseparable historical and spiritual ties, in order to suppress another people or to dominate them. In this land, whose population is both sparse and scattered, there is room for us and for its present inhabitants. Our return to the land of Israel will not be achieved at the expense of other people's rights.
thank you. And as he accompanied Jews exiting the concentration camps, journalist I.F. Stone reported,
Number one Jewish problem: how we act toward the Arabs will determine what kind of people we become, either oppressors and racists in our turn, like those from whom we have suffered, or a nobler race able to transcend the tribal xenophobias that afflict mankind.
thank you. By 1945, as much of European Jewry was wiped out in the Holocaust, the conversation changed. This was a time when Jews were not safe anywhere. Zionism was an understandable impulse. Jews wanted a home of their own, a place to be safe. And a different form of leadership from within the Zionist movement emerged, espousing what became known as political Zionism, advocating a strategy of conquest, displacement, and immigration to create a Jewish majority in Palestine. The political Zionists wanted all of the land and not the people. This is the form of Zionism that appears today. It simply won out over spiritual and cultural Zionism. Quoting physicist Albert Einstein in 1938,
Judaism owes a great deal of gratitude to Zionism. The Zionist movement has revived among Jews the sense of community. This productive work in Palestine has saved a large number of our brethren from the direst need. Now the fateful disease of our time, exaggerated nationalism, borne up by blind hatred, has brought our work in Palestine to a most difficult stage. I should much rather see reasonable agreement with the Arabs on the basis of living together in peace than the creation of a Jewish state. Apart from practical consideration, my awareness of the essential nature of Judaism resists the idea of a Jewish state with borders, an army, and a measure of temporal power, no matter how modest. I'm afraid of the inner damage Judaism will sustain, especially from the development of a narrow nationalism within our own ranks, against which we have already had to fight strongly, even without a Jewish state.
thank you. And in one of his last letters, Einstein said, the most important aspect of our policy must be the ever-present manifest desire to institute complete equality for the Arab citizens living in our midst. The attitude we adopt toward the Arab minority will provide the real test of our moral standard as a people. In 1948, a national Jewish homeland was established in Palestine. To accomplish this, 750,000 people, the indigenous Palestinian population, was forcibly displaced and their villages were destroyed. Implemented by David Ben-Gurion, who became the first prime minister of Israel, was Plan Dalet. Plan Dalet specified which Palestinian cities and towns would be targeted and gave specific instructions for how to drive out their inhabitants and destroy their communities. All this is carefully documented in Ben-Gurion's diaries. So that which happened for Palestinians at the time of Jewish independence and the state of Israel is called the Nakba. It's an Arabic word that means the catastrophe. Recalling the prescient caution of Judah Magnus, rabbi and chancellor of Hebrew University, he said,
if we cannot find ways of peace and understanding, if the only way of establishing a Jewish national home is upon the bayonets of some European empires, our whole enterprise is not worthwhile.
In 1967, Israel conquered the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights, and continues to maintain a military occupation over these territories in contravention of international law, which actually has Israel responsible for the territories, for the well-being of the people and the land that it acquired by force. In 2005, Israel withdrew its Jewish-only settlements from Gaza, created a blockade, sealing 2 million people in an open-air prison, Israel maintained control of the borders, the airspace, and the waters. Israeli military incursions into Gaza occurred on a regular basis, mostly 2005, 2006, 2008, 9, 12, 14, 21, and 23. Time for another deep breath. The sad truth is that the early dreams of Israel as a light unto the nations, a communal socialist endeavor, Leon Uris's book and movie, Exodus, all of that is fiction. Many people grew up with these visions and still maintain them. Would that it could have been so. When my parents returned from their second trip to Israel in 1955, they didn't know what is today. In fact, it was unknowable. The recorded history of 1948 only became available when the Israeli archives were opened, and the information which has shaped my politics was revealed. The new historians in Israel recast that standard Zionist narrative of a land without a people, for a people without a land. These historians, such as Benny Morris, Alon Papay, and Avi Shlaim, used the Israeli government's own documents that only were available in the 1980s to critically examine the history of Israel and Zionism. Their primary source research is unambiguous. Among their conclusions were these: the Jewish state was created at the expense of the Palestinians. Palestinians did not flee in 1948, but were forcibly expelled. And Israel bears the principal responsibility for the Arab-Israeli conflict. Next slide, please. The military occupation and the systemic violations of Palestinian human rights have been ongoing for 75 years. They're a direct consequence of ideological, political, legal, economic, and military systems designed to privilege Jews and support Israel as a Jewish nation state. You can read, right? Anybody who challenge to read? Okay. This is systemic injustice. Under international law, it meets the definition of apartheid. And yes, it's different from South Africa. So, criticism of Israel as anti-Semitism is inaccurate and problematic because Israel's a nation and must, like all other countries and nations, be accountable for its actions under international law. Now, and no, in my opinion, anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. Such a claim is what happens when an ideology, Zionism, uses a religion, Judaism, for its political positions.
Can I just jump in here? Thank you. So this is one of the places that I found just reading in general this past week as we were preparing for this discussions. Folks are saying that to be anti-Zionist means that you believe that Israel should not exist. And that is not what, Susan, I believe that you're saying, and that's not what, and I just want to highlight that point. Because that is definitely out there in the world, that to be anti-Zionist means that you do not believe that Jerusalem should exist. And that is not what we're saying here today.
Perfect.
Is that the same?
But isn't that
same
what every
anti-Israel?
Arab is saying, that Israel should not exist? That
Can you
is,
hold that to the Q&A? No, no is the short answer. It doesn't do justice to your question, so we'll hold it.
Yeah. Next one.
Thank you, you gave a segue. This moment that we find ourselves in demands information about a definition of anti-Semitism that is very popular today. It was put out by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is a group that promotes Holocaust research and education. I appreciate your fair consideration of my thoughts on this, as my positions on both challenge the popular views held in the mainstream Jewish community. In an attempt to control the spread of Jew hatred, this definition was put forth initially to help countries, institutions, organizations recognize, monitor, and record anti-Semitism. Sounds okay so far, right? Regrettably, this definition also considers any political discourse critical of Israel or the Israeli government as anti-Semitism, and defines Palestinians and people who stand in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for justice and freedom as anti-Semites. Here's the backstory from Ken Stern, who was one of the architects of the definition and no longer supports it. In 2010, our State Department adopted the definition, and by 2016, used it to serve a political agenda. It used the data to track an uptake in boycott, divestment, and sanctions activism, particularly on college campuses, and also Palestine solidarity and criticism of Israel. So criticism of Israel and criticism of Zionism are considered anti-Semitism according to this definition. Avi Schlein, one of the new historians who's an emeritus professor at Oxford University, says, a definition intended to protect Jews against anti-Semitism was twisted to protect the state of Israel against valid criticisms that have nothing to do with anti-Jewish racism. Worth a mention here, I can't resist, is the unhelpful role of the Anti-Defamation League. Jonathan Greenblatt, not to name names, is on major public networks pretty regularly. The ADL has a long history of asserting itself as a civil rights organization, which it is not. It fosters military policing, hyper surveillance, and funds police exchanges in which the Israeli Defense Force teaches police divisions within the United States the tactics of guerrilla warfare. The founder of the Critical Studies for Zionism, Emalia Gelman, says, the ADL instrumentalizes the public's real concerns about anti-Semitism, producing outrageously inflated statistics that list hundreds of demonstrations and educational events protesting Israeli violence as anti-Semitic incidents. The ADL attacks on critics of Israel often target Israeli peace organizations. Some of us call this a weaponization of anti-Semitism. Next slide. Over the past 75 years, Israel has maintained itself as a Jewish state with the policies and practices violating Palestinian human rights and international law, and they do this with the support of our tax dollars, 38 billion annually. Additionally, the United States has vetoed some 40 resolutions brought before the Security Council of the United Nations in an attempt to hold Israel accountable for illegal settlement building, the separation barrier, and other violations of Palestinian human rights. Anna Baltzer, a Jewish activist and author, recently wrote, "I don't believe that US support for Israel is driven by a concern for Jewish safety. It's driven by US imperial interests." And she adds, "Israel's policies have never been about Jewish safety. Does it make Jews safer to uproot Palestinians' olive trees? Does it make Jews safer to move Jews to where Palestinians are living and put them on West Bank settlements and replace the Palestinians who were living there? Does it make Jews safer to render Gaza uninhabitable? Of course not. These policies are consistent with a desire to remove Palestinians from their land. Perhaps the same motivation behind Israel's current carpet bombing and invasion of Gaza. The point is, Israel acts with impunity. It's like giving your drunk friend the keys to their car. As a US citizen and a non-Zionist Jew, I've long been critical of Israel's systemic violations of Palestinian human rights and the complicity of our government in funding these violations. But to be clear, I'm concerned about the people of Israel. I'm concerned about the militarism, the violence. Israel is not unique among the community of nations to violate international law and mistreat the people who live there. It's just that it's the country that does so in my name. For me, the heart of the matter is the issue of equal rights for all people who live there. Palestinian freedom is the core political issue. So you need to know this, though we're shifting a little bit. You'll probably hear more about this from Mark Braverman, but somebody want to read this slide?
The ecumenical deal, Christian-Jewish interfaith relations today follow clear rules that serve to insulate Christians from any appearance of anti-Jewish feeling, and that protect the Jewish community from any possible challenge or even perceived challenge to unconditional support for the policies of the State of Israel. These rules are playing out in the academy, in the pews, in interfaith relations on the highest levels, and in everyday encounters. They are rendered more powerful by never being stated or acknowledged.
Thanks, Mary. Next slide. And now the next. I could have opened today with what's called a land acknowledgement. You're familiar with what they are. And I would have said something about how we're living on land that once belonged to the Lenape people. This edict, somebody want to read it? Catherine?
Sure. The Papal Edict of 1493 played a central role in the conquest of the New World. The edict stated that any land not inhabited by Christians was available to be discovered, claimed, and exploited by Christian rulers. This doctrine of discovery became the legal basis of all European claims in the Americas, as well as the foundation for the United States Western expansion.
Apparently, the Vatican was trying to come to terms with the discovery of the New World and trying to head off massive wars between Spain and Portugal over gold. An updated version of the doctrine of discovery is manifest destiny, an ideology that inspired measures designed to remove or destroy a native population and to replace it. Like settler colonialism, manifest destiny presumed the right to settle on a land where people were already living. It's also among the roots of white supremacy. Next. So we're going to listen to a short piece of a talk by Israeli historian, one of the new historians, Ilan Pappé.
There is no way of understanding what goes on today, to my mind, in the right context, unless you are also a student of history. And the reason you have to be a student of history is not because of an intellectual interest in the past. No, this is not the reason. It is because the historical chapter that began in Palestine with the arrival of the Zionist movement is still going on today. We have not concluded that chapter. We are in the same time zone as the beginning of Zionism. This is not, we don't have a closure of that chapter. So we're not actually going to study history. We're going to study our own contemporary reality, even if that particular moment began 70 years ago, or maybe even 100 years ago. We have to deal with Zionism as a structure, not as an event. It's a structure. And a structure in history means that, yes, there is a moment when this structure is exposed, when this structure begins, but we are still inside this structure. That particular structure is settler colonialism. In fact, one of the great writers on settler colonialism who just passed away, unfortunately, Patrick Wolf, has this famous quote where he says, settler colonialism is not an event, it is a structure. I translated to my particularly case study. Zionism is not an event, it is a structure. And it is a settler colonialist structure. Now, in Israel, at this point, even those who wouldn't understand what settler colonialism is would walk out of this hall. The fact that you're still here after I said that Zionism is settler colonialism, is worthwhile. And most of those people who would walk out from the whole really wouldn't know what settler colonialism is, but they would be offended by the word colonialism. So let me go back to this idea of settler colonialism, because I think it's a crucial point. Settler colonialism, as you would know from the history of this country, is the movement of Europeans outside of Europe. And these people are moving outside of Europe in different moments in time. And mostly these movements are different from the expansion of empires into other parts of the world. These are movements of communities, of individuals, sometimes according to the lines of imperial expansion, sometimes preceding imperial expansion or following imperial expansion. Most of these people are persecuted for various reasons. And most of these people have no wish to stay in Europe and are looking for a new home. And they want also, when it comes to the 18th century, 19th century, they want to create also a new homeland. And in many cases, the main obstacle for creating a new safe homeland for people who were victims of persecution is the fact that they choose places where someone else is already living. And that's a problem. And that's a problem. And in many cases, the settlers dehumanize the natives and the indigenous to such an extent that they find it in their heart to genocide them, to eliminate, or to impose an apartheid system on them, or as in the case of the Palestine, to strive and get them out of their homeland, or as I called it in 2007, to ethnically cleanse them from their homeland. If we can, in any given moment, if in any given moment we can explain to people that there were many positive impulses behind Zionism, very noble, I would say, even impulse behind Zionism. The wish to save the Jews from what definitely was eventually a genocide in Europe. The wish of people to become modern and a modern nation. Even the wish to be reconnected to the Holy Land or the land of the Bible. These are all not negative impulses. These are understandable. But you cannot exclude the additional impulse, which complicated life for all of us. The other impulse that is not talked about is to get rid of the people who were already there in the land of the Bible. They were already modernized themselves. They were already building a national identity and collective identity, who lived there for centuries and were entitled to continue their normal life and to make their own decisions about the future, whether they were good decisions or bad decisions. This is totally irrelevant. This was their homeland, and someone else immigrated into their homeland and slowly but surely began to expel them and dispossess them in a process that started 100 years ago and reached a climax in 1948. There's no escaping from this. There's no way of rewriting that history. There's no escape from telling the Israeli Jews your ideology of who you are and who the Palestinians are was formed in that historical moment when your grandfathers and grandmothers, your modern ancestors decided what quite a lot of Europeans decided elsewhere in the world, that in order to create a safe homeland, yes, in order to create or reconstruct ancient Israel, call it what you want, you were fully aware that the only way you could do it is by getting rid of the Palestinian population. And there is no escape because it exists in every travelogue that your leaders have written on the way to Palestine. It appears in every diary that they kept. It is to be found in the archives of the Zionist movement and the archives of the Israeli state. You didn't hide it in 1882 because it was quite legitimate to talk about depopulation in 1882. You didn't even feel it was wrong to ask the British government in 1930 to help you to transfer all the Palestinians outside of Palestine, because this was an accepted language in 1930. So we don't blame you for being the same as many other European settlers who came to a different place. But you came very late in the day, and the Palestinians, to their credit, resisted you in the name of Palestinian nationalism. In 1936, they began a serious revolt against you, against the idea that you had the right to dispossess them, not that you had the right to live next to them. This you had the right, and they never denied you the right to live next to them. They resisted against your plan to dispossess them. And had not the British government helped the Zionist movement between 1936 to 1939 to destroy the Palestinian military elite and political elite, probably the resistance would have been even more successful than it was. And when you had, as Zionists, a great historical moment in 1948 to translate the idea of dispossession of the Palestinians from an abstract strategy that a small minority of Jews in mandatory Palestine could not implement, to translate it into a proper military strategy of expulsion, you did it. You understood very well as a political movement that 3 years after the Holocaust, the world would allow you to expel the Palestinians and wouldn't do anything against it. You knew that there was no leadership on the Palestinian side. You knew that the Arab world was busy with its own liberation struggles. Yes, you were very clever as politicians, as leaders of a political movement. 48 was the right moment to do it, especially because the British decided to leave Palestine. And you manipulated very well the international community to depict the Palestinians as the people who resist peace, who refuse to accept peace. You offered them to partition their homeland and to leave them 50% of their homeland. And you described their rejection of this generous offer, a term you will use again and again in your dealings with the Palestinians, as intransigence, as typical of a political culture in the Arab world, not progressive, not modern enough. And that's why the people of Palestine foolishly did not agree to give half of their homeland to a group of hundreds of thousands of Jews, most of them arrived in Palestine only 2 years before. Who wouldn't in the world say, I will give half of my country to immigrants who have just arrived 2 years ago?
Next slide. You want to read that? Yes.
Settler colonialism is a form of colonialism that is exclusive. It is a winner-take-all, a zero-sum game whereby outsiders come to a country and seek to take it away from the people who already live there, remove them, replace them, and displace them, and take over the country and make it their own.
Next slide. Take a minute and just kind of take that in. Zionism is an example of settler colonialism. Now, of course, that's what Zionism became. It's not what it started out as, and it's not what many people would have hoped and wanted it to be. This is the reality. And what is typically framed as the Israel-Palestine conflict obscures that structurally it's brutal settler colonialism. I contextualize and understand October 7th using this framework. Next slide. We know this all too well. slide. So look at the pictures and think about Israel as a modern settler colonialism example. What do you see in the pictures? Anybody want to say what you see? Soldiers, so militarism, right?
Hostility.
Hmm?
Hostility.
Hostility, right? What you're looking at, some of them, I think it's in that one, is the Standing Rock protests. So that there are systems of oppression that just bear down on Indigenous, Black, Brown, queer, and other marginalized communities. And they're manifest daily, all over, through police brutality, surveillance, repression, denial of access to basic needs. And really, not to leave out that regarding most of these things, corporations profit from the suffering. Next slide. Kind of more, but the picture at the top is Palestinians leaving during the Nakba. Next. So I thought it was important to look at international law. International law guarantees Palestinians the right to resist. It's unambiguous in its endorsement of armed struggle for people who seek self-determination under colonial and foreign domination. The United Nations Resolution 3743 from December 1982, quote, reaffirms the legitimacy of the struggle of people for independence, territorial integrity, national unity, and liberation from colonial and foreign domination and foreign occupation by all available means, including armed struggle. I'm a pacifist. I'm not advocating a point of view here. That's what international law says. So somebody want to read the slide? Yes.
Resistance under international law. Under international law, Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories is illegal, and Palestinians have a right to armed struggle against their illegal occupier, Israel. Thus, ipso facto, Palestinians have a right to defend themselves against Israel. But Israel's right to defend itself against Palestinian resistance is not guaranteed in the same manner.
This information actually was new to me. So I'm still taking it in and processing it. For good and for bad, international law doesn't get reinforced much. There are, however, I am aware of several suits being brought before the International Court of Justice as of this week about the crimes, I think both by Hamas and by Israel, crimes against humanity and war crimes. So come to your own conclusions about the egregious actions of Hamas on October 7th. I think it's important to say this. The paragliders were third-generation descendants of the people who lived on the kibbutz, in the little communities that they ravaged and where they killed people. They went back to where their homes had been and where their homes had been destroyed 3 generations ago. Consider that. I guess consider it in the context of whether bombing Gaza is going to fix that. So the next slide Um. How about Sue? Can you read that? This is a slide by Rashid Khalidi. He's the Edward Said professor at Columbia University, one of the foremost scholars on this issue. He's Palestinian. And he writes this about resistance.
The Zionist colonial enterprise aimed at taking over the country necessarily had to produce resistance. If you wish to colonize a land in which people are already living, Jabotinsky wrote in 1925, you must find a garrison for the land or find a benefactor who will provide a garrison on your behalf. Zionism is a colonizing venture, and therefore it stands or falls on the question of armed forces.
Oh, forget, that's a footnote, sorry.
Okay, thank you. At least initially, only the armed forces provided by Britain could overcome the natural resistance of those being colonized.
Thanks, Sue. So, do we end at 1? Is that when we end? Give or take? Okay, so I'm gonna just ask you to take one, like 30 seconds on each of the next slides.
Okay.
And you can do your own research to know more about them. But in contrast to the armed struggle, there is a huge nonviolent movement for resistance, all of which is called anti-Semitic, some of which was the Great March of Return by people in Gaza, all of whom showed up at the Gaza border. No one was armed, and 233 people were shot and killed. There are villages all over Palestine where people have peaceful vigils protesting occupation. They are always surrounded by Israeli soldiers, and they always kill people who are non-violently protesting. BDS is an international movement. You can learn more about it, and just thought this was interesting. These are the companies that contribute to the genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. So boycotting these companies is actually ethical resistance. And I think we have to ask ourselves, if we squelch this, do we get October 7th? Like, what kind of resistance can Palestinians do?
Susan, are these going to be available somewhere online?
We'll talk to Andrew about that after. And this is just sort of to lead into, and there's a couple articles about Palestinian Christians, because much of this series, which we anchored today in talking about Israel and anti-Semitism and Zionism, will move on to address the Palestinian Christians and what they're experiencing and what they're calling upon the international community to do. Next slide. So, justice, justice, shalt thou pursue. When people say that the Israel-Palestine situation is complicated, I have to say, I don't see it that way. Jewish Israelis have a right to a state in Israel. They do not have the right to violate international law by creating a state that dispossesses and destroys the land of the indigenous population, destroys the property, restricts freedom of movement, creates Jewish-only settlements, transfers its own Jewish population to the land that the Palestinians are living on, heavily guards it with the Israeli military, and completely protects the rights of Jews against the rights of non-Jews that live in the country. Equality under the law and respect for the dignity of every person is my bottom line. As mostly white, Christian, Jewish, other allies of faith and secular people, we must recognize, name, and act together against all forms of injustice, wherever it occurs. We must hold ourselves accountable for our privilege and our power and be brave to speak the truth and to engage in difficult conversations and to show up in solidarity with each other. In Jewish mysticism, the Kabbalah, the story of creation is told in which God has all this, there's the light of God, and God's light is contained in a vessel. And God's light was so strong that the vessel broke. It shattered. And the shards are spread all over. And that it's our job to find the shards of our broken world and collect them and create something new. The Hebrew word for this is tikkun olam. You're probably familiar with it. And that's to repair what's broken in our very broken world. So I just want to say the next slide, right? Those are the next two programs. I think there's a flyer about that. I want to thank you for coming today. If the impact of what I've said sparks a desire for continued conversation with me about this, please let Pastor Andrew know. I am happy to come back to continue this particular conversation beyond wherever we get to go in our Q&A. And also, I think over there, there's the last slide, there's a list of some readings for people if you want to dig deeper into any of this. There are two books I did not add to it, which I should have. If this is all really, really new to you and your head is really, really spinning, the best book to start with is a book by Sandy Tolan called The Lemon Tree. Been around for a long time, and for many people, it's the way in. Another book by a member of Christian Jewish Allies is The Other Side of the Sea. It's by Alison Glick, who lived for about 7 years in Gaza and married a Palestinian in Gaza and has a daughter who's in the United States with her. And daily we're tracking her ex-husband and her daughter's father as he goes from the north to the south and loses the ability to communicate with his family here about whether he's alive. That's all.